Aha, Derek.
Hello, Ian.
So this is Councillor Derek Antrobus, local authority councillor in North West England, and local historian of this amazing congregation that kickstarted vegetarianism in the 19th century. We're just waiting for Adam to get the link to join us. Hold on. Okay. So, just for anybody who has, for anybody who listened to Radicals and Romantics, episode 12 of Vegetarianism, the story so far, a while ago, who are the Bible Christians? Derek, can you hear me?
I lost you for a moment, but I can hear you now.
Brilliant. So could you just summarize, to jog people's memory, who the Bible Christians are while we're waiting for Adam to join us?
Well, the Bible Christians were a tiny religious sect, and they were deeply influenced by the writings of a Swedish mystic, Emanuel Swedenborg. And Swedenborg had this fundamental belief that God existed in every living thing. So because everything had a little bit of God in it, his followers tended to be pacifists. They tended not to want to harm other living things, because in doing so they would be attacking God. And it was that fundamental perception that I think drove the Bible Christians, and particularly its founder, the Reverend William Cowherd. They saw God, almost a mystical pantheism. They saw God in every living thing, and they extended that to animals. So the Bible Christian Church, as a sect, was established in 1809 when William Cowherd forbade his followers from eating meat, and its members went on to be the chief founders of the British Vegetarian Society, but also influenced vegetarian societies worldwide. So very influential, and all based on this very profound observation about the idea that God was in every living thing. And that meant that they were not only vegetarians, they respected the lives of animals, but they respected other people, and so they were inherently egalitarian. They were pacifists, they believed in education for all, and they were a great social reforming movement, and that just tied into quite a radical response to the horrors of Victorian England. And they were right in the midst of that, because in Salford you had the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the horrific circumstances in which many people were living. So they not only were the forerunners of vegetarianism, but they also gave the population of that time a glimpse of hope for the future. You shouldn't ask me to do a very brief introduction, because I tend to go on.
They are fascinating. Yeah. They are absolutely fascinating. Adam has had a couple of problems connecting with us, but we did have a test run earlier, and he was able to connect then. So I'm sure it'll be resolved. It'll be resolved shortly. I've got. So I have my email open in the other window, and I'm waiting on him then. So So we had. So when I was visiting you in Salford, and you took me to some of the places where this story unfolded, to the site of the chapel, and goodness me, it was rainy.
Yes.
Particularly in the cemetery.
Yeah.
But why was the cemetery so relevant to the Bible Christians?
Well, the
I know that we're jumping forward a bit.
Yeah, the cemetery was intimately bound up with the philosophy of the Bible Christians. One of the reasons why they were so popular amongst the working class population of Salford was that they offered free burials. And there, I think, I've seen different figures, between 5,000 and 13,000 people buried on the tiny plot underneath the site of the Bible Christian Church. Those bodies are still there today. Now, because the Bible Christians were committed to this idea of free burials, their church campaigned for the government to allow local authorities, local councils, to offer free burial, not to offer municipal burials to the poor, and this was seen as it was such a demand on people's pockets at the time to pay for a funeral and a burial, that this municipalisation was a very positive effect. And the man who in Parliament championed this legislation was Joseph Brotherton, who until his death in 1857 was actually the leader of the Bible Christians in Salford.
Well, I'm good. I have to, because Adam is with us. So
good to see everyone.
Hello, Adam.
Hi, Derek. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Adam.
So, Adam, would you care to introduce yourself to jog memories and to anybody who's tuning in, having not having, goodness me forbid, not heard the podcast?
Perish the thought. Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Shprintzen. I'm an assistant professor of history at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania in the USA. And I wrote a book a few years back called The Vegetarian Crusade, which sketches the history of the development of the vegetarian movement in the United States. And that story kind of starts with the Bible Christian Church in Philadelphia. So find me online. You can find me on Twitter at VegHistory. And I look forward to having this conversation with everybody today.
Brilliant. I just wanted to I just want to mention, because when I was in Salford with Derek, and we went to, there's this immense Victorian graveyard, as Derek said, the first proper municipal graveyard, and the biggest monument to it is to the guy who helped set it up. But when we went, I just want people to be able to picture the scene of drenching sheets of rain for that suitably gothic feel, but very difficult to record radio in it. I mean, can you, I don't know if Derek's going to vouch for how bad the weather was, or say, no, actually, by Salford standards, that's nothing.
By today's standards, it was quite mild. So today we have hail, snow, and lashing rain. So it wasn't too bad, but it was quite bad for summer.
So, obviously, you can ask our questions on Twitter. There is a group chat attached to this, and I will get alerts on comments on the WordPress, on the post on the veganoption.org that's associated with this. But having finally got you two together, because my experts on the Bible Christians never talked before. Well, one coincidence really interesting is how the breakaway of a or the colonizer or the colonial missionary expedition, however you want to talk about it, in 1817 followed just a year after the death of the Reverend Cowherd in 1816. And I wondered if there was a particular reason behind that timing, because we have this amazing, interesting tiny religious group in Salford, and 1816, their founder, their inspirational leader, dies. Almost immediately afterwards, quite a number of them are setting sail for America.
Well,
either of you may wish to answer that first.
My own view is that it's something of a coincidence, and that's because the Bible Christians, members of the Bible Christians, were very much involved in some of the radical movements of the time. As I said earlier, the thing about their theology was not just their vegetarianism, but their egalitarianism. And at that time in Britain, there were clampdowns by the state on these radical bodies which appeared to be threatening the state. William Cowherd had been a great proponent of the works of Thomas Paine, the great English revolutionary, and there were recordings of members of the Bible Christian Church parading in protest through Yorkshire towns, carrying banners about death to the king. And I think that's the main reason why some of them went to the States. It was seen as a land of religious tolerance and freedom. And I think it's sheer coincidence that the clampdown by the state on some of these bodies coincided with Cowherd's death. I don't know whether Adam has any better intelligence on that than I do.
Basically, I mean, I think I'll agree that the precise date is a little bit of a coincidence. But if you look at some of the records that William Metcalf wrote, who began the Philadelphia Bible Christian Church, he does mention that it's something that he and Cowherd had spoken about at length previous to his death, and he seems to indicate that they had possibly planned to go even earlier, but there was a war going on between the United States and Great Britain at the time, the War of 1812. So it seems as if there were maybe some flirtations with the idea before 1817, and it would not have happened during the war. But the fact that they actually do go even in 1817 is pretty remarkable. Immigration numbers in the United States just in general are still pretty small scale. I think in the 20s of 20,000 something around that time. So it's not an insignificant thing that they go at this moment in time. But yeah, I think Derek is absolutely right. That part of it is that they believed in the spirit of the idea of the United States as a place of tolerance and a place of opportunity. And Philadelphia is the most logical of places to become established with this sort of radical reform mindset. Certainly abolitionism starting to take hold there. You have the development of working men's associations in Philadelphia right around the same time. So it's sort of the perfect landscape for a reform-minded church to become established.
And it's interesting reading Joseph Brotherton. Joseph Brotherton took over from William Cowherd on Cowherd's death. But if you read Joseph Brotherton's commonplace book, in which he jotted down all kinds of notes on all kinds of things, there's a very revealing section where he talks about the progress to the West, and he says, it seems to me that civilization started in the East and that it was passed to Europe, but the future is America. So there was this actually fundamental belief that the future of civilization lay in the United States.
And I think that how the immediate history just post 1817 in the United States for the Bible Christians as it plays out kind of supports that. I mean, if some of the original members that had sailed west end up leaving the church right upon arrival, and the only reason they survive is because more people come from Great Britain. So I think you're right. There had to have been some pretty significant buy-in intellectually to the idea that the United States was the place where they would be able to thrive. But it is interesting that they continue to thrive in both locations, and partly, I think, because they are so interconnected.
Indeed.
It's interesting. There's, in the way perhaps that some Americans in the current climate look to Europe, Angela Merkel. You have the less free citizens of Europe looking to the New World, to America, as an embodiment of their Enlightenment ideals.
I think that was clearly very much the case. But although there were the group who went out to Philadelphia, and those links were very much maintained, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the Bible Christians back in England were a force for radical change. It wasn't just about escaping their society to a new world. They actually wanted to transform the society that they lived in.
I'm just astounded at the death to the king signs, which I've heard of before. I mean, when was this?
I'm sorry, Ian, I slightly lost you there, and I didn't hear your question.
If I heard correctly, Derek, you mentioned that the Bible Christians marched at one point carrying signs saying "Death to the King."
Yeah.
Could you say more about that? When was it?
Well, it was in the months and years immediately preceding the departure for the States. And Metcalfe and some of his relatives were, it's not so much that they were marching as Bible Christians, but as Bible Christians they were joining in some of the larger protests that were taking place at the time against the state. And some people attribute this to the economic circumstances, the climate at the time, which led to grain harvests being lower than usual, people demanding bread, and culminating in the Peterloo massacre in Manchester, when protesting workers were charged by the cavalry, and a number of them were killed. And it's interesting that Bible Christians, Joseph Brotherton in particular, were present at that. They witnessed that, and that only reinforced their radicalism. So I don't think it's that the Bible Christians as a force were marching against the state, but their values and beliefs led them to join with others who were opposed to the state.
Well, it's interesting for two reasons. I mean, I wasn't aware that that radical protest in the early 19th century got quite that radical, even though another strand of the vegetarian movement is it starts getting connected to each other in the Newgate prison. Obviously, because at the same time as the French Revolution is putting in France, the Brits clamp down on dissent, throw people together in Newgate prison. There is the nexus of radicalism, including vegetarians, but the separate strand, that ends up with the separate strand of the vegetarian movement, which I know, which would be a very big diversion.
Yes. But I don't think it's any surprise that the Bible Christians were involved in these radical movements. I mean, you read the accounts of William Coward's preaching when he freely introduced the works of Thomas Paine, quoting from this great radical revolutionary figure in the pulpit, at a time when the British state was absolutely terrified of the rising working classes. And if you read some of the history of the early labour movement and the trade union movement, you'll see that the government spies everywhere. And remember, we're talking 2-3 decades after the French Revolution, and the British establishment was still very, very scared that something like that might happen in the UK.
One thing that cropped up in the conversations we had, Adam, was that they didn't quite find Philadelphia to be a land of tolerance.
There is this irony that they're deciding to target showing up in Philadelphia because of its reputation as a place of reform, somewhat radical reform, but certainly of opportunity. And they show up, and there's pretty stark accounts of Metcalf and his followers walking the streets of Philadelphia and just being shouted down, that they're apostates. One of my favorite descriptions that shows up in an editorial in the sort of mainline Philadelphia newspaper referred to the Bible Christians as wolves in sheep's clothing, right? So that they're preaching a message of peace and of godliness, but there's also something kind of pernicious under there. In fact, Metcalf actually kind of goes out of his way to try to answer a lot of these claims, both in the newspapers. So he's taking advantage of the growing technology of the printed word, but even in his own sort of publications, series of publications called Letters on Religious Subjects, which is sort of his first foray into describing what the ideology of the Philadelphia Bible Christians is exactly. And while to Derek's point, a lot of their theological ideas are somewhat radical, and really interesting in terms of their thinking of bridging together sort of Enlightenment thought with religiosity. He does go out of his way to try to calm fears that they are in any way anti-religious, irreligious, or apostates, which you would imagine that call in the United States in the early 1820s certainly has a fairly strong potential repercussions to being claimed to be so problematic religiously. It's interesting, we're talking about politics, and this is something that I've been thinking about too, in terms of thinking about just vegetarianism in general, but it probably also relates to the conversation about the Bible Christians in general, is the political paths that both groups take. And Metcalf actually becomes involved politically in the United States. He's involved in sort of local Democratic ward politics in Philadelphia, which is a very seemingly not radical thing to do. It's very establishment. And there's a bigger sort of split, I think, between American and British vegetarianism in the 19th century. The Americans end up turning sort of away from radicalism, not necessarily in the 1820s, way further down the line. But it is interesting the ways in which these two paths sort of diverged over time, even as they remain fairly connected.
Kelly O'Donnell asks on Twitter, touching on this, any major differences or divergences between the organisation / its practices in the two countries worth noting? Did you? Shall I repeat that?
Yeah, no, I heard that. Wasn't sure whether Adam wanted to come in on that, because he's perhaps better placed than I am to comment on that. But I think it's really interesting point that Adam made earlier on about the connections between the two continuing. I mean, Metcalfe came back and worked in Salford for a period. So those connections, it was the Bible Christian Church. They were different congregations, but it was still the Bible Christian Church. And I think that the fundamental ideas of the on both sides of the Atlantic, from what I've seen, retained the same values and belief system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the exchange that's going on, even between the sort of leading figures, right? Henry Clubb by the 1850s comes literally straight from Salford to taking the mantle of the Bible Christians in Philadelphia. Eventually comes back to them in the 1880s. So I think, yeah, I think theologically, I think that the tenets remain the same. Organizationally, one difference is the United States. I mean, there literally is just the Philadelphia Bible, like the actual structure of the Philadelphia Bible Christian Church, and they don't really expand out beyond those walls. When they first arrive, it's Metcalfe and then a guy by the name of James Clark, who's another reverend, and Clark ends up heading somewhat, actually not so far west from where I am today, in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, and he establishes himself there as a farmer. And the record's a little bit spotty on what's going on, other than that there's some whispers that says that he tried to establish a church there and nothing really happened. And he ends up heading to Indiana, into the Indiana territory soon after that. So it's very centered specifically in Philadelphia, essentially for its duration, although its effect ends up becoming, I think, much more wide scale as it sort of coalesces towards a vegetarian movement in the United States.
I wanted to ask about, I wanted to follow up Kelly's question when it came to beliefs, because they got accused of being apostates, being people who'd abandoned the faith in Philadelphia. Derek, did they meet that kind of charge in Salford?
No, they were part of the religious establishment almost, and that's because they were part of the political establishment. The members of the Bible Christian Church in Salford provided Salford's civic leadership. It's very hard to say that your mill owners and your mayors are actually some sort of extremist religious, as you say, apostates. But so I think there was a very different context. They were certainly attacked by other sects, but on the whole, they were tolerated. And of course, they are included as a bona fide religious sect in the census. So it isn't quite the same, and I do think it's partly due to the fact that the Salford Bible Christians were part of the political elite.
I wonder too here if part of this does connect to dietary practices, since there would have been a longer tradition of people abstaining from meat in England. Because a lot of the criticisms that get aimed at the Bible Christians in Philadelphia, while it is bathed in these very typically 19th century strong language of apostasy and things like that, they're often proclaiming that they're problematic because they're trying to turn us towards their creed, and it's very not so secretive language to say they're trying to get us to stop eating meat. And there just wasn't that connection to meat abstention in North America at that point, at least from an organized sort of way, and certainly from a religious standpoint. There wasn't, an established Swedenborgian church, things like that. So I wonder if that's part of what the difference is as well. It's just the culture in terms of response to meat abstention was maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. If you look back into the history of Salford and of the Bible Christians, some of the connections go right back to the 17th century, a guy called John Byrom, well-known poet of the period, and he was a resident of Salford. He had connections which included John Wesley and other Methodists, and he was a strict vegetarian, and he was, they lived in Kersal Cell, which was the local manorial hall. He was one of the elite in the area, and he was a vegetarian. So vegetarianism wouldn't have seemed such an odd thing, and I think particularly in the Manchester Salford area, because as the city grew, the outset of the Industrial Revolution, quite frankly, there were people with all sorts of different ideas, all sorts of different values coming together, and it wasn't unusual to be unusual.
But Philadelphia maybe less so? Is Philadelphia in its way a bit more conservative?
There's definitely a push and pull. I mean, there's a push and pull politically going on at the time, which is sort of marking a larger push and pull in the United States during that time period, between trying to figure out what's to come of this post-revolutionary period, right? There's, on one hand, there's this real opportunity as you're getting towards the turn of the 19th century to, say, start disconnecting from the slave system, and yet, right, the 19th century turns, and essentially it's the moment in time where the United States becomes far more ensconced within that system. So even though a place like Pennsylvania is starting to it has started to formally separate itself from slaveholding, it's also a very gradual process, even by 1817. So yeah, I think that there is a certain strand of maybe not conservatism necessarily, but it is reflecting the bigger sort of post-revolutionary debates that are happening in the United States of what's to become of this new country after. I mean, 1817. It's only 27 years post the establishment of a somewhat stable form of government. So as much as there are questions in Europe about the fear of a French Revolution occurring, in the United States, there's fears of everything sort of collapsing as well.
But you don't detect any ideological, theological difference between the Salford and the Philadelphia churches?
Not that I've noticed. No.
And in fact, when the vegetarian societies were founded, that was again a coming together of the churches. It was people who were involved.
1847 and 51,
it's the Vegetarian Society in the UK was founded by members of the Bible Christian Church. Joseph Brotherton chaired the first meeting which established the society. Its senior members were involved in the administration of the society, but it was but that was a very northern base. In the south, in the London part of the society was very much influenced by people who themselves had been influenced by the American branch of the church, in particular William Alcott.
And if I remember, I think that Metcalfe explicitly says that in the first sort of rumblings of trying to form an organization, both Metcalfe and Alcott actually, that part of their inspiration was receiving literature about what was going on with the Vegetarian Society in England at the time, and that was their motivation. Basically, it was if they can do this, why can't we? I think they're in correspondence with James Simpson. I think sends Metcalfe updates on what's going on in the Vegetarian Society. So so I mean, it's literally a motivation for the Americans to actually get their act together and put something together, not so dissimilar.
And James Simpson is part of the the English Bible Christians and one of the people running the new British Vegetarian Society.
Correct. And I think if and Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Metcalf goes and speaks at one of the very early Vegetarian Society galas. There's a very fairly well known as these things are lithograph of
remember that.
And I think that Metcalf actually speaks at that. If I'm not mistaken.
I think so, yes, and you know it was these this toing and froing. I mean, James Simpson was part of this Salford establishment. He was actually a relative of Brotherton. And William Harvey, who was the mayor of Salford, and he became the president of the Vegetarian Society. Again, James Simpson was Harvey's son-in-law. So there were these very close connections within Salford, and Henry Clubb was James Simpson's secretary when he was in Salford, and then went out. So these connections just continued, and I see it as a joint enterprise. It's one of the interesting aspects of this, because when I started to research this, I'm an amateur local historian, so I'm interested in local history. What I find absolutely stunning were the links that they had, not only with the States, but in Germany, in Switzerland, in Scandinavian countries, where they were in correspondence with fellow vegetarians who wanted to set up societies. And it was this, I suppose, an early example of the phenomenon of globalism, the fact that improved connections across the world allowed people to talk to each other for the first time.
Yeah, I think there's a real need for somebody to approach all this from a global perspective. I mean, this really is a global history as it establishes itself, and maybe someday I'll get to that, but it is. I mean, and I think for both of us that we tend to be somewhat micro focused given our interests, but it's very easy to forget that this really does have global sort of impact, and the figures are aware of that at the time too. And that's precisely what they're intending to do.
Yeah. And one of the things that interested me was that. One of their early efforts to promote vegetarianism on a global scale was to take part in the World Fair in Chicago. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, that this tiny little sect with dotted around 4 or 5 in England and the Philadelphia connection, here they were with these grandiose visions to promote their ideas, values, beliefs on this global setting. It must have been really exciting.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important moment. It's funny, we were talking about the potential differences and splits, and I mentioned the sort of political angle. There's a funny moment that happens, not funny, but I think an insightful moment that happens at the World's Fair in Chicago. This is 1893, and the English group comes, and they're representing not just the Bible Christian Church, also the Vegetarian Society, in the same way that that Henry Clubb is there, and they're representing both the Philadelphia Bible Christian Church and sort of generally vegetarians in America. And there's an opportunity for these groups to meet Frederick Douglass, and the famous abolitionist, and the English Bible Christian Church members hop on this opportunity without hesitation. And the Americans apparently said thanks, but no thanks. So it seems to sort of symbolize that there is a little bit of a depoliticization of the American vegetarians during this time period, which isn't to say that they wouldn't have been interested. Certainly they have connections to abolitionism when it was an issue. But it is just kind of, that always struck me as sort of a funny little detail about how these groups have certainly become a little bit different in in their intentions, or at least mindset, by 1893.
I find that really fascinating. I hadn't heard about that before, but you know, the Bible Christians in Salford were some of the leading advocates with the abolitionist movement in England, and you see their names on petitions that were sent to Parliament, and you know, Henry Clubb, who went to the States, I remember reading about his experience, and you know, I had this great dilemma. He said, you know, I'm a pacifist, but I want to fight against the South. I want to fight for the liberation of slaves. And I think in the journalese of the time, it was described as going into battle without any arms, and that seemed astonishing at the time. But apparently, although technically it was true, he was a quartermaster, so he was he probably had a wagon handing out ammunition and food to the troops, which I suppose is going into battle in some way, but still very courageous to be there with the intention of not killing, even to defend yourself.
When I first started researching this, my friends and I always had a good laugh about the idea of the pacifist abolitionists serving in the Civil War, and of course his last name is Clubb, right? An actual violence, right? Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking about this the other day as I was going through some of my old notes, and there was actually something that I picked up that I didn't think about when I was writing the book. Sorry, I'm going to look down because I actually took a screenshot of this as I was rereading some of my notes. And this is what Joseph Metcalf, who's William Metcalf's son, had to say in his recollections about the Bible Christian Church and its view of the Civil War.